I've always been fascinated by art. I'd even consider myself to be somewhat of a small-time art collector, but it truly is quite fascinating. Take for a moment to consider what makes a certain thing art, what makes it artistic, and what makes it valuable. These are truly perplexing questions. You could look at the work of Roland Barthes, for example. Now, he took a blank canvas and he painted it white, and it literally looks like an untouched canvas because canvases themselves are white. Yet that piece of painting actually sold for $15 million. You could also look at the work of Jacques. He famously created a sculpture where he clumped Play-Dohs together and created this massive Play-Doh sculpture. And yet, that piece of art is being valued at $20 million. But essentially, you have a blank canvas and a bunch of Play-Dohs clumped together, and they're both considered art, very artistic, and very valuable in the artistic world. Why? Well, this question, as perplexing as it is, and I'm sure you don't really have an answer, and if you do, you can comment below, but this question has actually been perplexing us humans and thinkers since time immemorial. Thinkers have been trying to work out why. So tonight, through philosophy, perhaps we can look for some answers. An interesting thing about looking at it from a philosophical standpoint is that you get a wide spectrum of views, but hopefully we can get to the bottom of it. Well, the first thinker to really get into the bottom of this question has to be, in my opinion, Plato. Because since the time of ancient Greece, the question of art has really been a hot topic. Again, we all know that the Greeks are famous for their art. Now, Plato had a rather interesting view of art, because his philosophy is very much about viewing the world as reality and representation. So to him, art was essentially worthless, because to him, art was a representation of the real world or real thing, a real object, an imitation. And in his philosophy, he believed that as much as you try and create representations, you can never truly capture the actual quality of whatever you're trying to paint or create as art. So for example, if you were to paint a scenery, you could do a good job in painting it, yet it would never be exactly the same thing as a scenery. If you were to stand at the top of Timbuktu, for example, some mountain, and you were to capture the scene, as much as you tried, even with photography, you can never truly capture the real essence of being there. So with Plato, with this representation theory, art is worthless because it is merely an imitation that can never capture that quality that we are talking about. And it is an abstraction. So for example, if you were to look at a patch of grass, how much are you willing to pay for that patch of grass? Maybe not much, unless you really love grass, then I might be wrong. But most people, not much. Yet a painting of a patch of grass could fetch maybe millions, or maybe even much more. To Plato, such developments, even in the modern art world, is just ridiculous because, again, we are confusing many things. This at most is a representation. His counterpart, Aristotle, would have a very different view. Although Aristotle accepted that art is a representation of the world, but to him it was much more than that. Art is also very subjective. To him, art is able to create feelings in people. When we look at a certain representation, a certain piece of art, we have these subjective feelings, and that, according to Aristotle, is really the whole value of art. It's able to make us feel things. If we're able to have feelings from certain pieces of art, then most likely they must have value, because the value is really in the sort of emotions that it evokes in us. But also on the same sort of logic, then arts that don't really generate the same sort of feelings in us is worthless, at least in this perspective. But of course, we can see how both perspectives, if we were to take them as they are quite flawed. Plato's belief that it is merely representation, therefore it is worthless, is of course arguable, because again, art enthusiasts would say that art is not so much about actually recording an exact thing in reality. And maybe most would agree with the philosophy of Aristotle that it is very much about feelings. Yet that sort of determination alone does not explain much, because of course we don't know why and how we actually have these subjective feelings. And this is maybe where the French philosopher Roland Barthes could come in and provide some assistance. According to him, what makes something artistic is not feelings alone. That does not explain much. Rather, what makes something artistic is actually you. The value of art comes from really humans, us, the audience, our ability to actually create significance and meaning in the piece of art. If we are able to inject meaning onto the art, then it becomes valuable. So for example, if you were to take modern art, maybe why they are valuable is because they're very meaningful, and we are able to derive and create meaning from them. And that's what makes them valuable. And this view really builds on top to the sense of feeling, because now we're going a bit further. It's not just about the feeling. The feeling really comes from the significance that we're able to create from it. Barthes, of course, presents a very interesting theory that seemingly ties together the sense of representation with feelings, and of course deriving feelings from significance that we create from meaning. But it also does not explain some of the more arbitrary aspects of the art world, at least seemingly to outsiders. For example, there have been stories of how certain pieces of lost art from famous artists were discovered, and it blew up the art world. People were very into it. They created a lot of narrative about it. It was considered to be very valuable, even sold. And then it turns out that it was actually fake. And very quickly the value diminished. Now there is a very arbitrary question that is raised. If we are able to derive meaning from this lost piece of art, at least at some point, why is it that when it was considered fake, all of a sudden everyone shunned it and totally looked away? Does meaning change? Certainly the meaning should be the same. It is essentially a piece of art that at some point gave people a very emotional connection, a very significant definition as well. Why did it change the moment it was discovered that it was actually a fake? And this is perhaps where the great thinker of literature, Jacques Derrida, can provide us some assistance in understanding art even more. Well, according to Derrida, although he was really looking at it in the field of literature, the important thing about a work is not so much what it is or its meaning. Those things are important. The feelings that it creates is important. But the most important thing is actually the context of the work. That is the most important thing. The context is really where most of the value is derived. All creative works are produced in a certain context, and the context is really what gives it truly great significance that we can appreciate. You could say in the art world, this is the idea of provenance. Derrida famously said, there is nothing outside of context. Context is everything. And therefore, if you're looking at a fake painting, the lack of provenance, the lack of an actual context, destroys all meaning, because the context is very much part of the productive value, part of the overall appreciation of the art alone. Of course, when you look at literature, a lot of the great stories, when you read through them, they might be great. You might have an emotional connection to the characters, to the story. You might find meaning in it. And of course, an even greater appreciation happens when you understand the context to which the work is actually created. And you could apply this thinking as well to the world of art to perhaps explain why it might be seemingly arbitrary that certain things are considered valuable. Why is it when Roland Barthes creates a blank canvas painting, it is considered so relevant, so valuable, so artistic, and yet if I, Melvin Poe, were to do the same thing, people would not even bat an eye? And Derrida offers an interesting view. But perhaps as much as we try to understand it, we still don't. We could try and use the philosophy of Plato, Aristotle, Barthes and Derrida, but still it just seems to be such a quaint world. And this is where I think tonight we can end with the thoughts of Dickie, the famous art philosopher. He's quite famous for really putting out the institutional theory of art, for really clarifying everything. According to Dickie, art is considered art if it is accepted by the institution, or you could say the art world. Now, to him, something is art, an artifact is considered art if the artistic world, which consists of art critics and people who understand art and art history and also artistic techniques, if the world of art accepts a certain thing as art, then it is art. Now, it might sound like quite an elitist answer, but of course what Dickie is referring to is also part of reality. We know, of course, today that most art that is considered very valuable has been perpetuated by the artistic institutions, from, of course, the artists, the art critics, and also the dealers of art and the art auction houses. These are really the institutional players that are injecting, you could say, an objective standard of what is artistic, at least based on a very deep understanding of this entire field itself, from art history to techniques to everything. Ultimately tonight, to answer this question, what is art, I think the takeaway is we could combine all the philosophies together. One of the views is to say that art is an imitation of the real world, but it is something that creates value because it creates subjective feelings in us, which is derived from the meaning, which of course is contextualized within how it is actually produced. Or we can take the view of Dickie and conclude that art is art because the art world says so.